Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is the third YouTube session of the 10th fall edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. And yes, it is our 10th anniversary for Read for Pixels. My name is Anusha Kandasivam. I'm your moderator for this session. Today's YouTube session is also our 17th Read for Pixels live stream author panel since we started hosting panels way back in 2018. The Pixel Project created this multi-author panel sessions to be an accessible resource for writers interested in writing about female characters and approaching themes such as misogyny, sexism, gender, and violence against women with depth, empathy, and accuracy. So we have a very interesting topic for today's panel. It is We Are Not Things, a 10-year retrospective on sexism, misogyny, and violence against women in science fiction and fantasy. Here to participate are two award-winning and best-selling UK-based speculative fiction authors who have written some of the best English language fantasy in the world for the past decade and more. And here they are. Hello.
Hi.
So we have Samantha Shannon and Jasper Fforde. So let me give you all a little introduction. Jasper Fforde has been writing in the comedy fantasy genre since 2001, when his novel The Air Affair debuted in the New York Times bestseller list. Red Side Story, to be published in February 2024, is his 17th novel, and he counts his sales in millions. He lives and works in his adopted nation of Wales. Samantha is the New York Times and Sunday Times bestselling author of the Bone Season series. Her work has been translated into 26 languages. Her fourth novel, The Priory of the Orange Tree, was her first outside of the Bone Season series and was a New York Times bestseller, as was its standalone prequel, A Day of Fallen Night, released 2023, this year. She lives in London. And just an interesting tidbit here, it's also Samantha's 10th year anniversary as an author. Congratulations, Samantha.
Thank you so much.
So I know all of you were expecting Jen Williams as well, but unfortunately, we are very sorry to say Jen has had to withdraw from the panel at the very last minute due to an emergency, and she sends her apologies to everyone. But we will move on. Aside from joining today's panel, Jasper and Samantha have donated some super exclusive goodies to the stash of authors treats we have set up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels 10th Anniversary Rally Up fundraising page. And Jen has also very kindly done the same, although she can't be with us here today. I'll quickly go through what the goodies are. Jasper is offering a very rare and exclusive bundle. It's a critique bundle comprising one written critique of the opening chapter of your work in progress, 2,500 words max. Jasper will read that first chapter and constructively highlight the positives and offer suggestions as to where you go from there. And he will do 5 follow-up questions in a 30-minute chat via Microsoft Teams after he has sent you his written critique. So this is a very amazing bundle. It's very rare that you get something like this from a experienced writer like Jasper, so go and check it out. So Jen is offering 2 different types of goodies. One is the Jen Williams Thrilling First Edition book bundle. This is for US and UK donors only. It's a signed and personalized first edition bundle of her mystery thrillers, which comprises one of A Dark and Secret Place and one of Games for Dead Girls. And goodie number 2 is Jen's exclusive critique bundle for donors worldwide, which is a written critique of the first 3 chapters of your manuscript and 1 round of 5 follow-up questions via email with Jen after she has sent you her critique. And Samantha is offering one Read for Pixels donor, either in the US or UK, a chance to get a signed and personalized first edition hardcover of A Day of Fallen Night. This is the prequel to The Priory of the Orange Tree and the perfect bookish treat for fans who are raring to dive back into that universe. And actually, Samantha's book has been snapped up by Amber Hansen. So thank you so much, Amber. Thanks for donating. We've raised $2,435, which is 24% to our $10,000 goal so far. So do please give generously before the fundraiser ends in October. All of the funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. All right, so before we get into the panel, you, the audience, can participate. You can ask the panel your questions. Just make sure you're logged on into the YouTube account so you can type your questions into the chat box. And Regina, who is today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to me, and I'll read them out to Jasper and Samantha to answer. Okay, so on to the panel. I'll give a little introduction to what we're discussing today. So the title of our panel today is We Are Not Things. So when Mad Max Fury Road was released in 2015, it created a massive splash as an unapologetically feminist dystopian science fiction film. There were many ways in which the film faced sexism, misogyny, and violence against women head-on, but none more powerful than when the enslaved women at the heart of the story defy a totalitarian despot and his patriarchal regime by escaping captivity and leaving behind the message, "We are not things." A simple but powerful message that encapsulates and reflects the treatment of women and girls in pop culture and wider society. 8 months prior to the release of Fury Road, the Pixar Project created the Read for Pixels campaign, which is this, and it is part of our work to end violence against women. We did so because we recognize that stories, storytelling, and storytellers, including authors, in pop culture play a key role in awareness raising when it comes to difficult social issues such as violence against women. However, However, we were and still are keenly aware that popular genre fiction, including SFF, reflects the sexism, misogyny, and violence against women across society, and in many cases plays a role in perpetuating this issue by normalizing such beliefs. In honor of the 10th anniversary of Read for Pixels, today's panel will be discussing how fantasy and science fiction has progressed and changed over the past decade with regard to sexism, misogyny, and violence against women in genre stories, in books, as well as what science fiction and fantasy community can, including authors, readers, publishers, and fandoms, can do about it. So here's our question. Both of you have been writing speculative fiction, primarily fantasy, for at least a decade, we know. And all your books and stories have feminist sensibilities and are excellent examples of how to write compelling and complex female characters in a genre that hasn't always been kind to women and girls. Do you think that there have been any changes, or indeed any change at all, in the way SFF novels and stories have handled sexism, misogyny, and violence against women over the past 10 years? Let's start with Samantha because she's next to me.
Sure. I think there has been quite a lot of change. I mean, certainly I think the conversations we're having now are different to the conversations we were having when I debuted in 2013. I mean, there was always like an awareness of feminist issues as far as I remember, but I think the conversations we're having have definitely, these specific issues we've been talking about have been different. I think there is more of an awareness now of the fact that fantasy and sexism have been so closely tied to one another over the years. I was actually just saying in the green room before we started, like when I recently revised my novel, The Bone Season, and there were a few points in it where there was sexism where it just didn't need to be. And when I reflected on that, I think it was because back in 2013, I really thought that fantasy was just sexist inherently. And I think I think sexism has always been tied to fantasy in some way because fantasy draws so heavily from history. And there has been this idea that fantasy needs to be realistic because it has to be realistic specifically by being sexist, by being racist, homophobic. And the idea being that because history was that way, fantasy also must be that way. But then I think now we're having conversations asking, well, if a genre can have dragons and magic, then why does it also need to have sexism? You know, fantasy is not beholden to history in any way. Like we can move away from that if we want. And then I think we've also been having different conversations about how we represent women and what makes a strong female character. So I think there was a period in my career where strong female characters were equated with being masculine, basically. And if a woman was feminine or soft, then she was considered to be a weak character. And I think now we're having more nuanced conversations about what exactly constitutes strength in women. And I just think the conversations we're having are more interesting and more nuanced now.
All right. Yep. Jasper, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I think with all the points there. I have to say, I'm not a huge reader of, sort of classical sort of fantasy, sci-fi. Though obviously, I do watch movies. But what's interesting, I think, because as writers, obviously we are also looking at the zeitgeist. We are also, feeling as you said, we're always sort of feeling the boundaries of what we are doing and what we shouldn't be doing and what we should be doing. And what I've noticed, is personally, as I've carried on writing throughout the years, I started off in doing one particular thing, and I have strong female roles and everything like that. But as the last 10 years have gone on, I've figured what I'm doing right, and what I should increase, and what I'm kind of doing wrong and I want to actually try and stop doing. So actually it's a very interesting thing as a learning process for one's technique as a writer, because when you start as authors, we're, wow, look at me and I've got these words down, I'm checking my word count constantly and I'm having fun with this, and all of a sudden there's this dragon appears and blah blah blah, and we're doing this stuff, and it's sort of coming from the what I call back of head. The best sort of writing is the one that you do without really thinking about it. And obviously your politics gets into your politics, and your worldview have to carry on through to your writing. But when this happens, you're not 100% sure of what it is you're doing or why it is you're doing it, and it's only later when you're getting feedback from readers and you see things in the news and movements happen and you observe other things and you go, yeah, okay, no, I think that's interesting, and what I'm doing this and what I should be doing. So it's actually a very interesting personal journey for writers, I think, a lot of writers. But you can see around us, there are movements, there are things happening, and things are going in, I think, good directions. I think there are obviously, bad directions as well. But as authors, again, I mean, if I can be sort of lofty and grand, is to say that we're trying to improve an imperfect world, which maybe we're trying to do. We kind of know where we can, what we need to do and where, and I think that's really important for writers.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, do you think that do either of you think that, because like Samantha, you said that people thought that fantasy needed to be sexist because that it reflects the world. Do you think that fantasy should reflect the world we live in now, or can it reflect a world that we want it to be, like a ideal world?
This is a point I have made on that topic before. I think that there has been this idea that fantasy, because fantasy has historically leaned on history, that it must lean on history. But fantasy is the genre of possibility. And, as Jasper says, it's kind of about striving for a better world. And also, as speculative fiction authors, we have the ability to show the world as it could be as well, which is why, for example, I try to write about things like queendoms in my books. There hasn't historically been a queendom, but it's still an interesting idea to look at and to imagine, for example, how a matriarchal society might work. And we do, in fantasy, the only limit is our imagination. So while I do think that there should always be space for authors to explore history, to explore topics like violence against women and sexism, it should also be okay to show worlds where we do not have to face these things, worlds where there isn't violence against women constantly, where there is no sexism, or it's explored in different ways. So I do think that the idea of this relationship between fantasy and history, as much as I personally enjoy it, like a lot of my work does lean into history, like especially my Roots of Chaos series, but also you can lean into history without having to take every single aspect of history with you. So, you can use, I don't know, medieval outfits without having to transport medieval sexism as well. And often when we have used history, sometimes it's leaning on a myth of history that never really existed. So you'll get people, for example, if you have a person of color in a fantasy book, they'll say, oh, well, that's not accurate, because they have this false idea of the world or certain continents being all white at certain periods in history, and it's not even true. And it's this idea of gatekeeping fantasy in that way. And I think that can be applied to sexism as well. Like if you get a strong woman in fantasy, well, that's not right, because there were no strong women in history. We've always been oppressed, and there's never been women who broke away from that or kind of defied the sexist expectations of the time. So yeah, I think it's a very complicated topic, but ultimately history should be something we can use in fantasy, but we shouldn't be beholden to it, in my opinion.
Yeah. What do you think about that, Jasper?
Yeah, I mean, it's a brilliant point. It really is. I mean, I'm trying to remember the name of this movie, because I mean, the interesting thing about history is often historians who have perhaps a little bit of a right-wing agenda will trot that one out all the time, and when you do that, you make people invisible. And I'm trying to think of the movie we were watching the other day. It's about I think it was Meryl Streep playing this awful singer who find their way onto Broadway in the 40s. It's a comedy, but the final scene, You know the one I mean, yeah. Well, the final, and it was great, and Streep's wonderful as always. But there was a scene at the end in which she was giving a concert to servicemen, right, U.S. servicemen, and in the audience were white servicemen and black servicemen, right, which would never have happened, right. And I was watching it and I going, this is the correct use of a slight changing of history, because if you did history properly in that respect there, then you would take away from a lot of black US servicemen the fact that they served honorably in the US Army and struggled against fascism. So I'm looking at that and going, well, yeah, okay, it's not historically accurate, but it should be socially accurate for 2022, whenever it came out. So, and this, I think, alludes to what Samantha was saying about this is a very, very complex issue. But I think there are points at which you shouldn't be historically accurate because of the invisibility issue. You know, there are so many people who have been completely entire, swathes of communities erased from history. So one has to be careful, and I think you can play fast and loose for, I don't want to say greater good, but to rebalance a historical imbalance.
Yeah. So the movie you're talking about is Florence Foster Jenkins.
That's it.
Yeah. Okay, so talking about moving the conversation forward, let's talk about what's been happening. So ever since Mary Shelley, who is the mother of science fiction, put pen to paper to bring us Frankenstein, speculative fiction authors and creators have used stories and storytelling to tackle important social issues. However, while we've seen plenty of critique about everything from racism to fascism in classics such as The Twilight Zone, it seems that the portrayal of women has remained problematic, and issues such as sexism, misogyny, and violence against women continue to be treated as convenient shortcut tropes by many spec-fic authors and creators. Violence against women has been one of the mainstays of pop culture for years, and it draws huge audiences, as we know. Screen adaptations of fantasy series such as Game of Thrones, for example, have been criticized as contributing to the further normalization of violence against women, of extreme violence against women in entertainment over the past decade or so. Do you think there has been any improvements on this front in the last 10 years? Especially with the Me Too movement kicking off a lot of discussion about these issues, as well as exposing some big name male authors as misogynists and abusers. Samantha?
I do definitely think that there's been more of an awareness of and discussions about those things. I remember when I was still on Twitter, there were many discussions about Game of Thrones and how it portrayed women. And I was specifically talking about the adaptation here. I haven't actually read the books. I had a lot of strong feelings on it myself. I think often one of the things I had a problem with was that sometimes you would see a woman, for example, being sexually assaulted in the background, but she herself was not explored as a character. She was a kind of background dressing. And I think violence against women can be used as a shortcut to basically saying that this world is dangerous and bad. I think that is a little bit of an issue where you have essentially sexual assault as window dressing. It's a very nuanced topic. And I think the fact that we're talking about it more is very important. Again, I do think there should be room for creators to explore topics like violence against women. Any issue that still affects us now, as violence against women very much does, I think there should always be space for authors to talk about that, especially, for example, if they have experienced it themselves. Like, it's important that they have a space to be able to tackle that topic. I think it's just more, it's the expectation of it that bothers me. And again, this kind of ties into the point I was making about fantasy and history, to the point that history has become an expectation of fantasy. And I think that a lot of the conversations were happening around Game of Thrones. So, for example, there is a character in Game of Thrones, a very prominent character, who is sexually assaulted. A lot of people were very upset by that scene. I was very upset by the way it was filmed, personally. Like, the focus was entirely on a male character's face while it was happening. And I remember that one of the things that were being said by people on Twitter was something along the lines of, again, well, it's historically accurate. And I do think there was a lot of conversation around the time about whether it was really necessary, like what the purpose of the character going through that was. I've seen other shows where, again, sexual assault just seems to be used in a very extreme way. It's one of the reasons I stopped watching Outlander, for example. There was just so much sexual assault in that show. And again, I don't think the creators handled it badly per se. There was just so much of it that I found it overwhelming. So again, it is a very complicated topic, but I don't want it to be an expectation of popular culture. And I think that sometimes, like when it's not present, I think this is where you can tell there's a problem. Sometimes when it's not present, people kind of call a show woke or something, just because it has women who are not being mistreated and are in positions of power. I mean, I've seen my own The Roots of Chaos books. I've seen those being criticized for kind of pandering to women. And essentially, I don't really know what that means, but I think essentially it includes women with I know, I mean, it's like, am I pandering to myself? What does that mean? Or they'll say it's like the feminist woke agenda. And it's just baffling because, you know, and I actually saw The Witcher being accused of this as well, because there is a character in The Witcher, like a female character, I think her name's Calanthe or something like that, and she uses a sword, and she kind of acts in perhaps a way that's not considered traditionally feminine, like she's very loud and kind of like she eats like really aggressively, like she's like biting into chicken legs and stuff like that. So she's got a bit of like traditionally masculine swagger to her, I suppose. And I just remember the amount of fury there was about that, and it was completely bizarre. Like the idea that a woman using a sword was so radical and out there, and it was just really puzzling. And I think that fortunately there was a lot of people calling that out as well. But yeah, it's something that I'm glad that we're talking about more.
Yeah, Jasper, what do you think? Do your books pander to women, Jasper?
It's one of those bizarre statements. It's where someone's sort of just written it on Twitter or something, and this will trigger them, you know. And it's like, what's it mean? It doesn't mean anything at all.
Yeah.
Or maybe it does. I don't know. But I don't know. It's a really hard one. I mean, I personally speaking, I don't like it. And if there's it's all about context. You know, I mean, this is all about context, and it's all about, I think there's context. There's also about when you're talking films or TV series, we're talking about intentions of director and also how things are perceived. So you've potentially got three things which you've somehow got to bind together in a way that works. And doesn't come in a negative way. And I'm probably going to get this wrong now, but it was the series Happy Valley with.
Oh, I love that series. Oh my god, Sarah Lancashire.
Who's the actress? Manchester.
Sarah Lancashire, is that her name? Something like that. Hang on, have I just made that up?
Sorry, we've I can't remember. I mean,
we'll figure it out. Yeah.
Tremendous actress who just brought such a vitality to that role, I thought. But the beginning of the second season, I couldn't watch because I thought that was too aggressive and violent, and I didn't think it was necessary. And when season 3 came out, I thought, when I watched that for a bit, and I went, hang on, I've got to watch season 2 again. So I sort of went and did. But there's a strange sense of context about somewhere, and and if someone's been murdered, okay, people get murdered, and I understand that you have to say these things to, enable the film or the TV series to happen, but the way in which or how it was done, I think there's a sort of subtle dark art to getting it right. And I believe this was a female director as well for the series, and I just didn't quite understand why that had happened. And I'd like to know actually the gender of the screenwriter as well. Someone could probably tell us in the comments.
In the comments, yeah. So if anybody knows that, please tell us in the comments.
I do think overall that is such a great show in terms of how it deals with like women, especially having like a slightly older actor play the main character, Catherine, who's amazing. But yeah, I completely agree. It definitely depends on context. And I think this actually applies to House of the Dragon. Actually, there's something that happens in the first episode of House of the Dragon. There is a very, very violent scene involving childbirth, and it's the first time in my life that I actually had to physically turn away from the screen because I felt that physically sick. And I was originally I reacted quite strongly to it, just thinking, you know, why on earth would they repeat that degree of violence against women that they did in Game of Thrones? Like, haven't they learned from it? On reflection, I could see what they were trying to say, which is that women, you know, especially historically, were considered to have a real lack of autonomy during childbirth and in the matter of producing heirs. So again, I could see the rationale behind it, but it was still really quite stomach turning to watch. So yeah, but then, you know, violence against women is stomach turning, and therefore, you know, I was clearly supposed to be repulsed by it. That was what they were trying to create, that feeling in me. So I had to sit with that for a while and sort of tease out my own feelings about it and understand where my disgust was coming from.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I guess you're right. It's a fine line on how you deal with or how you portray it, and what message you're trying to get across, which some people might get it and some people might not, I suppose. Yeah. Well, yeah. On a related note, related to violence against women, do you think that this a violent alpha male character type that's common in certain subgenres such as epic fantasy, grimdark, and hard science fiction has started phasing out of speculative fiction or in fantasy in the past decade, or do you think that it's one of those stereotypes that's going to stick around for much longer than expected?
I mean, I feel like there is more of an appreciation for the soft boy nowadays, to use his internet name. So I do think in the last few years, like when I see books being, there's kind of this trend towards advertising books in terms of tropes at the moment. Like you'll have pictures of books with like all the tropes they include. And often it won't say alpha male as an advertising point. It will say something like soft male character. So I do think that there is more of an appreciation forming for male characters who are gentle and sensitive and who are compassionate and aren't necessarily these really aggressive alpha male kind of characters. I think he will always be around somewhere. I just think it's such a staple of certain genres, and probably in romance as well. I don't read a ton of romance myself, but I do imagine that there is like a sector of alpha male romance out there, and I think that's okay as long as we're talking about the ways in which that character can be toxic. And I do think that it's slightly different when writing young adult fiction as well. I think when you're writing adult fiction, there's room for a little more nuance. I do think it's still important to portray toxic traits as being toxic. But when you're thinking about young adults, they are often entering their first relationships. Books and media are helping them to create a sense of what is normal or desirable and what is okay to accept in a relationship and what it isn't. So I do think there should be significantly more focus and discussion of that in YA, you know, to call out the alpha male traits that are not so great.
Yeah. Jasper, what do you think?
I totally agree. I mean, I don't think whenever I have an alpha male character, they always end up dying like about a chapter in. Because there was a character in a book I wrote called Early Riser, and I just kind of like the idea that sort of it was meant to be a sort of Jack Reacher kind of character, and I'm not saying anything against, you know, or pro or anything against Jack Reacher, but I wanted this sort of really strong sort of alpha male character who's just sort of strode in and everything was fine, and them to die, you know, unnecessarily, you know, about 2 chapters in, and then their assistant, who is sort of slightly overawed but also kind of not that happy about working with them, has to take over. And that's, you know, and that's what I like doing with these characters, and I think it's what I've been doing with a lot of my work. Is you take a trope and then you just invert it. And you can find some very exciting different things. You know, imagine writing a book about Jack Reacher without Jack Reacher in it. You know, that'd be quite interesting for me. Or any of these characters, you know, okay, take any book that you know that has a strong, you know, super strong, you know, slightly sort of, you know, passe, if you like, alpha male character, and then kill them off at the beginning of chapter 3 and see how the book turns out. And for me, that is interesting. That is interesting.
That would be a really compelling story. I feel, you know, instead of getting your same old alpha male again.
Also, I do think it's possible as well to create a character who is traditionally masculine in terms of being like physically strong without necessarily making him sexist as well. So I actually did this in my my most recent novel, A Day of Fallen Night. There is a character called Bardholt who is like the king of this essentially kind of a Norse-esque, Viking-esque type country. And I really wanted Bardholt to be this very strong, intimidating character. You know, he's got like big muscles and he's killed loads of people. He wears a crown made of the bones of his enemies. But he's also a very sweet and loving husband. And he has a really lovely relationship with his daughter. And he very much considers his daughter exactly as worthy as, you know, he would think of her if she was a son. I tried to really create like a really healthy father-daughter dynamic between them. So I think a character can be masculine without leaning into toxic masculinity.
Oh, yeah. Totally.
Yeah. So you were saying soft boy, Samantha, and another term is cinnamon roll, which
yes,
the cinnamon roll here is awesome. Yeah, they're great. You can have lots and lots of muscles and also be kind and empathetic, right?
Yeah, and I do this in my Bone Season series as well. Like, again, the main character is like this kind of immortal giant, essentially. And again, I could have made him quite scary and aggressive, but I try to subvert expectations, like Jasper was saying, and he's very much a gentle giant. And I personally think that's more romantic.
Yeah, we have a comment here from audience member Elaine who says Bartol is the best. He's great physically, etc., etc. But the kicker is that he has emotional intelligence.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, that's what we all want, actually. I think.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So, all right. So let's move on to our next cluster of questions. It's about writing stories. So one of the ways in which science fiction and fantasy authors can help with changing the patriarchal culture that normalizes violence against women now and in the years to come is to write the right stories or tell the right stories. This is what Joe Hill said in our first ever Read for Pixels live stream session 10 years ago. So let's get down to the nuts and bolts of storytelling and science fiction and fantasy authors who like to include violence against women as a theme in their stories. What do you think are the pitfalls that science fiction and fantasy writers who have never included VAW in their stories before need to bear in mind when they want to include it?
I'm not sure if it's a pitfall exactly, but something that I have found interesting over the years is that sometimes people, like readers, have come to me at events and they've said, before I read The Priory of the Orange Tree, or maybe seen me talk about this before, that they had automatically made their world sexist without thinking about why. And that's essentially what I did, as I said earlier, when I created the Bone Season. There is no logical reason for the world of the Bone Season to be sexist, but I had just done it automatically, maybe with some degree of internalized misogyny, or just seeing a lot of media where sexism was kind of the baseline, especially in fantasy. Like when I was a kid, I feel like I was always looking for the women in fantasy, because even in something like The Lord of the Rings, you know, it's not exactly sexist, but there's like a degree of benign sexism in the fact that the women are just not, I mean, you know, the female characters are great. I think Eowyn's great, Galadriel's great, but they're obviously not, there's not as equal a focus given to them as there are to the men. So I feel like that can create this kind of unconscious thing where people will just create sexist worlds without really thinking about why they're doing it, whether it actually makes world building sense. And again, I guess just what I said earlier about the idea of violence as window dressing. I think if you are going to deal with the subject of violence against women in a book, you should make sure that it has sufficient room to breathe and that you can properly explore that topic and give it the time that it deserves.
Right, Jasper?
Yeah. No, I'd agree with all of that. I mean, I think the pitfalls. I mean, the thing is that often when you're writing things that you write them and they feel right, you know, when you're writing. And I suppose there's part of oneself that should be asking, okay, this feels right, but is it right? And I think perhaps there is some little part in your head that should be sort of checks and balances about whether, writing something is correct, or whether you're not still using something subconsciously that perhaps has had its day and there isn't another way of telling the story. I think there's always, there's always a more elegant solution, is a kind of by phrase that I kind of work by, and I tell my children about, that there is always an more elegant solution to everything, when it comes to dealing, arguments or anything at all. And I think in storytelling, there is also a more elegant solution. And sometimes violence against women, or any violence, whether you think it should be, it is in the right context. I sometimes think that violence is lazy shorthand for better writing. That you could actually write some, because we're talking about, making a real shocking statement here. And I think the better way of making a shocking statement just with better quality writing, and actually make the, this incisive moment in your book, not a murder, but a train or something. I mean, I always like to quote from, or talk about Strictly Ballroom, which has a tremendous amount of drama, which is all about, dancing your own steps and whether you'll be allowed to do that, and whether you can be with the right partner. But there's no guns, there's no jeopardy in the traditional fashion. And I think it's good writing, that you can make drama out of not murder. Do you have that murder? Do you really need to have that violence? Can't we somehow create that drama out of something, much more interesting, like the dog that barked in the nighttime? So
I think this extends to the language we use as well, and I think those are all amazing points. And I think we can sometimes do violence in the language we use about women in our books. So a really good example is actually the word wench, and it's such a fantasy staple. The tavern wench. It's a thing that we use without thinking. But I read the most fascinating essay a while ago. It actually has a deeply problematic history. Like, not only is it very sexist, but it actually has a very racialized history to it as well. And I feel that we are and very few people know this. I didn't know it before I discovered this essay. And I just think we need to, sometimes when I see that word getting used, I think to myself, do you really need to call a woman a wench in this book? Like, is that 100% necessary? Like, why are we doing that? Do you know the history of that word you're using? And I do think this also extends to using words like bitch and whore. Like, I think often they can appear a lot in historical and fantasy books. And sometimes I think, I don't want to imply that authors are always doing this, but because sometimes it is done with a distinct purpose to it. But sometimes I think, are you using the shield of fantasy and history to use those words too much and to describe women in that way? So I do think that we need to think quite carefully about the kind of misogynistic language that comes into our fantasy books.
Yeah, and it's lazy as well. Why don't you give them a name?
Yeah.
That would be radical, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
women with a name. Yeah. I think what we've been doing is because like you said, Samantha, we've all grown up with these classic fantasies where they're sexist, but we've grown up with that being sort of the normal kind of fantasy. So when authors start writing fantasy, or you kind of think that this is how fantasy should be. But there is a way to move the conversation forward. There is a way, like Jasper said, to be different. There's a more elegant solution to it. And I guess, but doing something new is scary.
Yes.
Maybe.
Well, it was scary, when I decided to use the word queendom in The Priory of the Orange Tree. It looked really weird for a while, and it felt weird for me to say it because queendom is not really a word, or it wasn't a word at the time. But then surprisingly, the more I used it, the more normal it felt, just because I was normalizing it by using it so much. And now I've seen quite a lot of books that use the word queendom, and it's really nice to see that. So we can affect change in that way, just by questioning the established norm.
Yeah. So, which brings me to my next question. Do you two have any tips and suggestions for portraying female characters who have experienced violence against women, rape or domestic violence, or any other form of gender-based violence, without reducing them to the sum of their trauma?
To be honest, this is something I'm wrestling with myself at the moment, because each of my books have dealt with sexism and violence against women in slightly different ways. So the Bone season, like, there is no sexism. So there is violence against women, but not because they're women. There's just general violence against people in some aspects of the Bone season, because it is a dystopia. And then in The Priory of the Orange Tree, I deal more with what I might call structural patriarchy, where, you know, women are being used in hereditary monarchies and they're having to give birth over and over again. And I'm trying to question hereditary monarchy in that sense. But now, actually, I'm about to write a novel inspired by the Greek goddess Iris, and it's going to be dealing with violence against women in the Trojan War, specifically sexual violence against women. So this is something that I'm going to be reflecting on a lot myself, because it's not really something I've had to do before. Therefore, I feel as if I'm not necessarily in a position to advise until I've actually written this book. But I think I'll just repeat the point I made earlier, which is that making sure that you give it sufficient time, that it's not just a throwaway line, and yeah, not making, I mean, I think we've often talked about sexual assault being used as a woman's phoenix moment in popular culture, where this is the thing that makes her. And I think, again, sorry to bring up Game of Thrones, but it's such a cultural benchmark. I think most people will be familiar with it. It reminds me of the part in Game of Thrones where Sansa says, you know, if not for you and Ramsay and the rest, I would have been a little bird for the rest of my life. So she's basically saying that if she had not gone through all of these different kinds of violence and horror, that she would have just stayed this innocent, naive girl forever. And there is something quite problematic about that, like the idea of, you know, rape being used as a way to develop a female character. And again, I do think it's so important that authors feel able to discuss this issue and are not criticized merely for including violence against women, because it is something that's important to talk about. But yeah, I just think that giving it that breathing space is really important.
Jasper?
Yeah, I mean, I don't write about these things so much. So, I mean, for the clear reason that I don't wish to, you know, I don't think it's part of my purview and what I write about. But I mean, if you're going to talk about these things, then I suppose, and as a writer, you want to write on the effects of them, and that's what I would do. I mean, in the few areas where I've sort of, you know, touched upon it, there is a character, my protagonist, again in Early Riser, who doesn't have any pronouns. You don't actually know, you know, throughout the book, which is quite nice, because I sort of slung it under the radar, so a lot of people actually didn't know that and didn't notice it until it was pointed out, and they realized so there's no gender pronouns at all. So you have to make up your mind, you know, how the story works. But buried deep in that character is a backstory of trauma, but you would have to pick apart the bones quite carefully to find it. So it's, yeah, I mean, that is how I would affect it. I mean, the only time I suppose there is a sort of coercive sexual encounter in one of my books, but it's female on male, which again flew under the radar. No one ever mentioned it, which is interesting in its very own right. But that was in Shades of Grey. But in Red Side Story, I slightly expand upon that, where we invert breeding possibilities from female to male, which I can do within the context of the book. So, you know, things happen and you can play with them. But for me, and the way I would look upon it is the effect, you know, the traumatic effect that these things have, and what it can either take from you, or, you know, and as Samantha was saying, you know, that this somehow gave you something. And I would say, no, I think it takes away, and it's lifelong. It doesn't go away. It really doesn't, you know, and that should be I think that should be a resounding part of, you know, the effects of this trauma. It doesn't go, it doesn't leave, it stays forever.
Which reminds me of we had Stephen Erickson on some years ago, who writes epic fantasy, and he was saying that a lot of readers of his book series had a really big problem with one of his characters, this young woman called Felicien, who they really, like, she got a lot of flack, but because she was awful, she was a jerk, but she was recovering from sexual assault. She was a survivor and she had PTSD. So he had actually portrayed the effects of all the trauma that she had gone through. And for years, people were hating on this character. And he said in the panel, like, why? Think about it. What would you do if these things had happened to you? Would you recover immediately? And which made people actually start a discussion in the Facebook fan groups about, like, oh yeah, he's right. She's suffering from PTSD. You can't just have a character go through all this trauma and then be absolutely 100% perfect in the next chapter and go on with the story, right? So yeah, it's something that needs to be portrayed, and we don't see often enough, I think. But yeah, maybe it's happening more and more now. Yeah, Jasper, you were saying you kind of sneak things into your stories, but how do you think authors can engage with the issue of violence against women in their books without sounding preachy? Should they sort of sneak them in like you do, or like do it like in your face and say this is what it is and this shouldn't happen?
It's a really, really hard one. I mean, it really is, and I always think that relegation's the wrong word, but perhaps subplot that you can see something that's going on perhaps in the background, but isn't actually the main part of the book, because then it can become preachy. And and as I said earlier about we bring our worldview and our politics into our writing, I think it's impossible not to. And it's trying to find a way to tell a story that doesn't come out preachy, and that's tricky. That's hard, and it's good writing, I think, and you've really got to sort of pull out all the stops and try and do the best you can. I mean, I wanted to write my anti-colonial Brexit anger book, but trying to do that without post sort of kind of anti-British, really, and and who
I'd read it.
Yeah, thank you. And who we are, and where we came from, and the exceptionalism that we're given as school children. And then you get to this crossroad like Brexit, and you suddenly question everything that you were told about being British. That actually no, it's this is the engine, the furnace of Brexit was xenophobia and racism. And it's like, okay, oh my God, were we racist all along? And you go, oh, the colonial era, oh my God. And then how do you tell a story like that? So the way I did it was a sort of fantasy allegorical, in which there are 1.2 million rabbits living in the UK. And the ruling government is a United Kingdom anti-rabbit party, UKARP, as they're known. And they want to get rid of rabbits, and they're kind of using rabbits as a way to sort of gain power. And so you've got to be subtle, and you've got to be good, and you've got to try and use some sort of allegory. You've got to come at a different angle, because being preachy, you just don't want to do that, you really don't, but you want to bring forward. So tell the story. This is the story. Behind it is your kind of politics, I would say. Don't make your politics the story. You've got the story, and the story's great, and everyone's having a terrific time reading the story. Behind the story is the politics and and what you're trying to say. So that's what I'd say about not being preachy.
Do you agree, Samantha? What do you think?
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. And the way I personally deal with this, as Jasper says, it is very difficult. There is a very fine line between being preachy and just expressing beliefs you personally hold. And again, like Jasper says, I think inevitably our own politics and beliefs do shape our storytelling. For me, I suppose I would go back to the fundamental rule of show, don't tell. So, for example, in The Roots of Chaos, this is a world in which women can be knights, they can be leaders, they can be doctors, whatever. Like, there is no profession that is closed to women in the world of The Roots of Chaos. But instead of having women face, I don't know, men, for example, saying, well, you can't be a leader, you're a woman. And then she makes a speech about how women actually can be leaders because women are equal and powerful and great. Instead, I just have women occupy these positions of power without any comment. And while women do face certain kinds of difficulties in my world, mostly related again to kind of structural patriarchy, I think it's almost, for me, I just have the women in those positions and the men are not complaining about them or disrespecting them. They are just treating them as if it's perfectly okay for a woman to be a leader or a knight. And again, there is a degree of nuance to that, because I guess there can be power in stories where women are overcoming overt sexism. I mean, I think we all enjoyed aspects of Game of Thrones where Daenerys, you know, sees men who don't believe in her and then she burns them to death. That was empowering. But at the same time, I do the way I personally deal with it, because I think that kind of storytelling can risk kind of tipping into the preachy if you're a little too overt with it. So I just prefer to show women being in positions of power, and hopefully that indicates that I believe that women are equal to men and are just as worthy of holding those positions, but it's not something that I'm kind of writing down for the reader. They're just seeing it.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. All right, so we don't have any questions yet, so we still have time for questions from the audience if you want to type your questions in, but we have a lot of comments and a lot of discussion going on in the chat box, so I'm just going to put a few comments up to show everyone. Jazz says, I'm now just bored by stories where violence against women is just used to progress the plot and women have no agency. So many more interesting stories can be told without it, as Samantha is proving.
Thank you. I'm glad you think so.
And another one, I also really enjoy how Samantha and other authors normalize diversity, example, including non-binary characters. It helps redress the erasure of different types of people we often see in stories, which is what Jasper was talking about just now. Yeah. All right. So good for time. So let's talk about tips and recommendations for science fiction and fantasy community, including writers, readers, editors, publishers, with regards to tackling sexism, misogyny, and violence against women. Do you think there have been any changes in the attitudes of people in the community over the past decades with regards to these things, violence against women and misogyny?
I would be interested to hear from Jasper on this, because I feel like there's certain aspects of the community that I'm not really aware of. But one of the things I do feel is important is men talking to each other more about these issues. And I'm kind of curious to know, like, what kind of conversations male authors have been having about this, because I feel like we have been talking about issues within the community, but I feel like, so much, it's just so important that men are talking about it among themselves. So I would be interested to hear about that.
Yes, so passing that on to me. I'm gonna drop the baton here and fall flat on my face. I mean, I don't really kind of know what's going on within the communities. I don't hang out on sort of community sort of bulletin boards or what's going on. So I don't really know, and I don't have massive amount of friends who are authors, because I'm kind of accidental author. So I don't really. Certainly in conversations with other men, I mean, it has changed. Things are definitely changing over the years. And I mean, just recently, I mean, it was the our hands up here. I'm a Formula One fan, and it's the Italian Grand Prix Monza. Actually going on at the moment. So I'll have to sneak back in a bit. But it's very interesting. I mean, F1 as a sport, because it has 600 million followers, and they reckon at least 35% of that are women. In 2018, they still had grid girls, which was, a mammoth problem for me, and I really, and for my wife. But as soon as the grid girls went, she went, I can sort of get into this now, and now we've had Formula W racing, which is women only racing, which obviously has arguments for and against. But the important thing about it, if you can see it, you can be it. And we now have Jamie Chadwick, who's a great racer, and she won the Formula W. She's a pundit now for Formula One, and Naomi Schiff as well. She's on Sky TV, which is huge. And she's up there with, the male presenters as well. And let's not forget Lewis Hamilton, fantastic, absolutely amazing ambassador. He was wearing a LGBTQ helmet in Saudi Arabia. So, and this is since 2018, the mammoth changes. And, that's obviously my personal experience. And obviously things changing with women's soccer, which has had a massive, just unfortunately got defeated, or fortunately for Spanish, and then it all kind of went, it all up in our faces, as you saw with this. Like, what? I mean, you get so far, and then all of a sudden, people are assaulting people. And it's like, this is sort of crazy stuff, and he refuses to go, but he should, and he will eventually. But these are inroads, and these are inroads to people who perhaps are not within the reading community. If you follow F1, I don't know, I can't make these aspersions, but things out there are happening, and they're happening, and hopefully if we can reflect those, and conversations I've had with men, although my male friends tend to be obviously a little bit more like me, perhaps. But even conversations I've had with other, male friends who perhaps are not of the same politics, there are changes afoot.
Yeah, I think within the sort of fantasy community, it does help that there are so many female authors now. I mean, I feel like we're in a real golden age of fantasy where there are just so many women writing like books that are reaching a lot of readers. And so when you go to fantasy events, you are seeing many female authors. I think it's to the point that we can no longer be ignored or sidelined. I mean, certainly I still do have conversations with male readers where they'll say something like, you're the first woman I've ever read, or I don't read women. But it's becoming, it's strange, isn't it? Like just kind of push away 50% of the population. It's very interesting. But I do feel like that's getting less and less now. I am seeing more men coming to my events, for example. I mean, most of my readership is female, and that's what I expect. I don't mind that. I feel like most of my books are written with women in mind, but I am seeing more men coming and engaging with my work, and not just dismissing it as books for women or kind of feminist agenda or whatever it is some detractors would say about it. So I do think we're moving in a positive direction. And like I said, I do think this is a really great time to be writing fantasy as a woman.
I mean, just picking up on what you were saying about someone coming to say you're the first woman I've read. Initially, one thinks, that's like saying you're the first woman I've listened to, and actually, this is someone who's made a change to themselves.
Yeah.
So actually, I think that's a real positive. And initially I was kind of thinking, what? So, and you go, no, and the fact that he came up and said that, I think there's a certain vulnerability, maybe. I mean, if we look at this on the positive side, so I think that's a win.
Yeah. No, I agree. I admire the men who admit that, and they will often say, now I will read more women. And obviously, you want them to have been reading women earlier, but like you said, they are making a change, and they've recognised that is something that they would like to improve on. So I do think that's a positive thing.
Right. Do you have any tips and suggestions for publishers who wish to join in the efforts to address sexism, misogyny, and violence against women in speculative fiction phase in SFF? Or anything you would like them to do?
I do. Like I said, I mean, I do this obviously just speaking from my own personal experience. I do think that they are moving in a good direction with that. There do seem to be a lot of fantasy stories being acquired by women. As always, I would say that more intersectionality is always good. I think that publishers need to make sure that they are not only publishing a diverse range of voices, whether that's in terms of race, sexuality, gender, but also that they're supporting authors from all different backgrounds. Like it's one thing to acquire a book. It's a very different thing to support it, to make sure it is as successful as possible. So I think that is something I would definitely like to see more of.
I mean, Hachette, I published by Hodder, and Hachette have had this policy, for a while, but it's kind of ramped up recently about increased diversity. And I've noticed, I went and did a presentation to Waterstones and booksellers, and it was quite notable actually that the makeup, not only the makeup of the authors that they were presenting, but also the subject matters. About the invisibility of Black community in the sort of 16th, 17th century, and that's something that I hadn't seen before in fiction. I've seen it in non-fiction, but I hadn't actually seen it in fiction, and that was interesting. And so hats off to Hachette and the big publishers. But it is a kind of more of a big publisher thing, because when you've got some celebrity bio that sells trillions, you have the luxury to be able to spread the net broader. So smaller publishers, if you're not doing it, I can understand, the issues surrounding it about, obviously having to, make money and everything like that. But I would just say, I think there was again, bringing sport into it. I'm not into American football or soccer. I promise you that. But this is a very interesting policy, is that somebody said in this national football, NFL, a National Football League in the States. And what they said was that when they're looking for coaches, you have to have one person of diversity, one person of color be interviewed. That's all you have to do. They have to be interviewed. And everyone is sort of, oh, well, tokenism. And we go forward 15 years, and there are now 5 major black coaches on NFL. And it was because of that policy. And I think that's quite an interesting way of looking at things. And that's all they always said, is you just have to interview them. And they suddenly realized, actually, hang on a sec. And I thought that's a very interesting way of looking at it. And you could say the same as small publishers. It's like, read everything, and you'll be maybe beautifully, pleasantly surprised.
Jasper, for a person who's not a fan of NFL, you sure do know a lot of like all these little details.
No, this is an author thing. So that's what I'm all about it. Is we have mind like drift nets, and we like pick up all this information because it's all interesting, and you can all
you can use it somehow.
It's like when interesting about when you Samantha was talking about changing genders around, and people can do these things. I do it in just references to, you get a plumber in, and some characters will say, oh, we had to do a plumber, and you get, what did she say? And so you can do this in this such subtle fine way. Now, I think often you our minds just gather these little things, and we regurgitate them years later into this tiny little nugget that is going to bring the story on in that tiny little way, but it works, And I think authors, we're always trying to be very economical. You want to say a chapter with 3 words, and sometimes having all these little factoids to in your head, sometimes it really helps in that manner.
That is such a good point, actually, about the kind of the plumber in the background, or like the driver, or so. I think that we sometimes default to male in our heads, and I did this with my second book, The Mime Order. There's a scene where my main character confronts like one of the dystopian police officers, and I use the pronoun she. And my editor actually made a point of commenting on it and saying, "Oh, how fascinating! She's a woman. That's really cool." Because I defaulted to a man for the evil dystopian police, and I do think that's so important, of just having background characters who are the characters who are making the world work and run in the background. Sometimes being not men.
I quite often make secretaries male.
Yeah, good for you.
If there's a traditional female role, I'll quite often make them male. Just to move it around.
There was this science fiction series in Canada called Killjoys, which is a bit obscure, I guess. And I remember there was one scene where the character said, "I went to see the doctor," and then the other one says, "Oh, what did she say?" And I was like, "Oh, okay," because in my head, of course, the doctor is a man. And then I learned in that world, doctoring medicine is a traditional female profession. So all the doctors are women, and I thought, oh, that's interesting, turning things on the head just makes a compelling story. Okay, so we have questions rolling in. I'm so sorry, everybody. When I said 10 minutes ago we have time for questions, but they're so last minute now. So I think I only have time for one question. And because we were talking about ideas and using ideas, let's ask Christine's question. So Christine Wilder asks, what do you find inspires you the most or helps you get solid ideas when writing super elaborate, complex fantasy worlds? Samantha.
Oh, I feel like this is a question that authors kind of slightly dread, what inspires you, because we draw from so many different places. I think for me, there's so many things I draw on to create fantasy worlds. One of them, as I've said, is history. I do find history really inspiring in various ways. The Roots of Chaos series is very historically inspired. I draw from like the 16th and 17th centuries in the Priory of the Orange Tree, and then the medieval era for A Day of Fallen Night. Yeah, so many other things like travel, just ideas I want to express. Yeah, this is such a tricky question because I feel like inspiration it can just hit you at the most unexpected times. Like music inspires me. I had a dream the other night that actually saved one of my characters from death, just because in the dream she died and the plot became better, which makes me sound slightly unhinged. But yeah, how about you, Jasper?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any author who'd answer any differently. I mean, we get it from everywhere. I mean, if you're overhearing a conversation in a cafe and you're doing that because it's got a little ring to it, and you're just kind of logging it and thinking, now, why would they say that? And what sort of person does that? I mean, I find quite often how I write, and for people who are beginning to write, I think this might be helpful, is I sort of change one small thing in our world, and then everything changes. And I seem to be talking quite a lot about Early Riser, but in Early Riser, it's a thriller set in a world in which humans have always hibernated, and discuss. And I think I didn't have a plot to begin with, but I knew that because the world would be so subtly but wonderfully, brilliantly different, that the plot would come off somehow out of the way in which the world functions. That is where my plot would come from. So I never plan any of my books anyway. But so I call it to the narrative dare principle. You take an idea and you just subtly change something, and then you sort of figure out how the world would work in our world, with this subtle change, and then you'll find something interesting that will really pique your interest, that comes across in it, and then you will start concentrating on that idea, developing that idea, and all of a sudden you'll have an interesting plot that works within the framework of the world that you've constructed, and it will look as though it is completely seamless, which of course it will be. So, it's a kind of slightly a sort of mind thought experiment, a keyboard experiment, if you like. But that's pretty much how I write. What if there were 1.2 million rabbits in the UK? Discuss. What if you
That's great advice.
Discuss.
Great advice.
What if Humpty Dumpty was a murder mystery? Discuss. So that's generally what.
Who says it isn't? I always wondered who pushed him off.
Well. The Big Over Easy, available at all good bookshops. Find out.
All right. Okay, so we've been talking for more than an hour. So here's my final question for this review. What speculative fiction books would you recommend for authors and readers to check out as examples of violence against women being handled well?
I have 3 recommendations. So the first one I'm going to start with is an author who is actually mostly known for contemporary fiction, but she's just writing her first speculative this year. Her name is Holly Bourne. She is a UK-based author. She mostly writes young adult. Her upcoming one is called You Could Be So Pretty. And Holly is so good at confronting sexism, violence against women, toxic relationships. And she does it in a way that is so accessible for young people. She'll highlight what it is like to be in these situations and sort of healthy ways to remove oneself from those situations. I just think that Holly is brilliant and is such a great ambassador for women. The other 2 are both fantasy. So one of them is called The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri. I think this is one of the most magnificent fantasy books ever written. There is violence against women in one of the religions in Tasha's world. It's basically where women are like ritualistically burned, but it's handled so gracefully and it's never unnecessarily explicit. There is very clearly a reason that Tasha is doing that. And it's such an incredibly a series that is so focused on women and gives so much space and complexity to its female characters. So that's my second recommendation. My third one is The Daughters of Izdihar by Hadir Elsbai. And again, it's a book that is set in a sexist world where women are trying to secure the vote. It also involves magic, and I just think it was really great. I was gripped by it all the way through. And again, it does tackle sort of violence against women and dislike of women, but again, it's done in a way that I thought was really thoughtful and considerate and interesting.
Awesome. We've had Tasha Suri on one of the Read for Pixels campaigns. can't quite remember when it was, but if you all want to go and listen to her talk about her books and Violence Against Women in her books, including Jasper Fforde, go and search through our videos on our channel and you'll find it.
Yeah, she's great.
Yeah. Jasper, recommendation.
The dog ate my homework. All I can say. No, seriously, I got caught out then. Yeah, I didn't actually write anyone down at all. I didn't read my notes specifically. Nothing I can think of springs to mind. But I'm not a huge reader. I mean, weirdly, I'm not a huge reader of speculative and fantasy fiction. I have to say, I kind of just, as I'm an accidental writer, so I read completely unrelated stuff. I'm reading at the moment a book by a person named Otto English called Fake Heroes, which I love. And that's all about how we've made fake heroes out of people. And there's a very good chapter indeed about women who've been airbrushed from history, of which he tackles, I think, very sensitively and very well. But no, well, Samantha's given us 3, so you're kind of left me off the hook. The dog ate my homework is my.
Okay. Well, that's fine. I mean, if you also want to find more books about where violence against women is handled well, again, go and check out our channel and check out all the authors that we've interviewed over the past 10 years. They've all have had a lot to say about violence against women and how they have tackled it in their books or how they've sort of evolved over the years themselves from when they first started writing, like you, Samantha, and how they've changed their thinking and tackled it in different ways over the years. So yeah. Okay, so we've reached the end of our Q&A session. I am going to do a little wrap up. If I can find my notes, here they are. Okay, so thank you, Jasper and Samantha, for answering all the questions. Before we go, I'm going to tell everybody again about the super exclusive, exciting goodies that we have set up as perks for donors on our Rally Up fundraising page. If you missed the beginning of the session, let me just tell you what Jasper and Samantha have. Jasper is offering 1 written critique of the opening chapter of your work in progress, 2,500 words max. Jasper will read the first chapter and then constructively highlight the positives and offer suggestions as to where you go from here. And it will be followed by 5 follow-up questions in a 30-minute chat with Jasper via Microsoft Teams after he has sent you his written critique. And as you all know, Jen Williams was supposed to be in the panel, but she couldn't make it today, but we still have her goodies. So she's offering a first edition book bundle for UK and US donors only, which comprises A Dark and Secret Place and Games for Dead Girls. And she's also offering an exclusive critique bundle for donors worldwide, which is a written critique of the first 3 chapters of your manuscript and 1 round of 5 follow-up questions via email with her after she's done, after she sent you her critique. And Samantha also had a really awesome goodie. It was the first edition hardcover of A Day of Fallen Night, which has already been snapped up. So things are going really quickly. We also have plenty of other author goodies available from authors such as Anne Bishop, Brandon Sanderson, C.S.E. Cooney, Mary Robinette Cowell, and R.J. Barker. And there will be a fresh round of goodies released on Friday, 8 September, this Friday, coming up. So far we've raised $2,435 towards our $10,000 goal. So do give generously. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. So I am going to show a slide, if I can get it up. Here we are. So that's the links, and the links are going up in the chat box as well. Regina, our chat box moderator, is putting them up. So you can donate to go to our Rally Up fundraising page. That's tinyurl.com/r4p Rally Up 2023. And then if you want to learn more about Read for Pixels, the panel sessions we have coming up, or the other authors we have for our 10th anniversary, go to our website, to our Read for Pixels page, and that link is going up in the description box, in the chat box as well. And I also want to tell you about our really awesome charity anthology. It's the Pixel Project Shirley Jackson Award-nominated and Audio Award-nominated charity anthology, Giving the Devil His Due, where it's sort of like The Twilight Zone meets Promising Young Woman. It's available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook editions. It's 16 short horror stories, and they're really awesome. You can order it from any major bookseller, Amazon, Audible, Kobo, Barnes & Noble, Spotify, Google Play, and more. For more information about the anthology and how to score a book plate, visit our Giving the Devil His Due page on our website, and that link has gone up in the description as well. All net proceeds from this book, from the audiobook and from the ebook, go towards keeping the Pixel Project's campaigns, programs, and initiatives such as this one alive and kicking. And the anthology is a limited edition, so it's only available until 31st October, so go and get your copies now. And if you want to find out about violence against women, all its forms, what you can do to stop it, we have a lot of accessible resources on our website. Go and check it out, www.thepixelproject.net. All right, so before we say goodbye, Samantha and Jasper, do you have any announcements? I think, Samantha, I think you do.
Yeah, so my most recent book is a complete revision of my first ever novel, The Bone Season, which first came out in 2013. I have basically revised the whole book with 10 more years of writing skill. So it's the same story, but just written a little differently. So if you haven't started the Bone Season series yet, or if you would like to reread it, I would really recommend picking up the anniversary edition, which is available now.
Jasper, you have something?
Yeah, so I've got, this is so Red Side Story. This was for anyone who has read Shades of Grey and was wondering where the sequel was going to appear. This is it, and it comes out in February. So Red Side Story, February 2024, the sequel to Shades of Grey. That's my Shades of Grey, obviously not the other one.
What other one? What are you talking about? Yeah. Could you hold the thing up a little closer to the camera? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's it. Red Side Story. Long-awaited sequel. Yeah. All right. So once again, thank you everybody for your questions and your comments. Thank you, Samantha and Jasper, for being here and doing this with us on our 10th anniversary. And we'll say good morning, good afternoon, good night, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.